Thank you very much to the organizers for their efforts and Natalie Denk for the constant and effective communication. For this paper, I essay on the notion of codephagy to four study cases coming from the Mexican context. The notion of codephagy, codigofagia, is a concept coined by Mexican-Ecuatorian philosopher Bolívar Echeverría. He coined it to describe cultural life, mainly in the urban context of Latin America and particularly in Mexico. It is used to avoid the biological connotations that other notions such as mestizaje or hybridity have. Codephagy is defined as, and I quote, the process in which different codes of social behavior at their encounter try to devour to one another. This process is maybe the most characteristic in Latin America. The act in which Latin America begins to exist is the process through the European code devour the remains of the pre-Hispanic code. At the time that is transformed by those remains, and as the dominant code, it tries to integrate it to itself. The role of the indigenous people in America is the most interesting in this process. It is them who rebuild not their code, but the European code. It is them who, by doing that, transform the code from the inside. End of the quote. On the other hand, I take from Barker and his Dictionary of Cultural Studies the definition of agency. He states that agency can be understood to mark the socially determined capability to act and to make a difference. Acts that make a pragmatic difference. Neither human freedom nor human action can consist of an escape from social determinants. Socially constructed agency involves differentially distributed social resources that give rise to various degrees of the ability to act in specific spaces. There is a risk of utilizing a concept coined to describe the process during the New Spain period to analyze recent times, and that is, it could convey the idea of an essentialist conception of the Mexican. This could mean that it supposes there is something shared from the people from centuries ago that is still present nowadays. By consequence, this could have a nationalistic ideology in the background that considers that Mexico, as a nation, as a culture, or even worse, as a homogeneous set of cultural traits have existed from centuries ago. I don't consider that there is a continuous history from the glorious Mexican or Aztec Empire to modern Mexico. Instead, I use the concept of codephagy as it is used by Italia Schmelz to analyze contemporary media, in her case Mexican science fiction movies, and here video game practices in Mexico. It is necessary worth noting that Bolívar Echeverría considers codephagy as part of his theory of his historical ethos, which are ways of behavior and not time periods. The ethos are the ways in which we react and internalize modernity and capitalism in the spontaneity of everyday life. Echeverría mentions that, and I quote, if cultural identity stops being considered as a substance and is viewed more as a state of code, then that identity can be showed as an evanescent reality, a historical identity that, at the same time, it determines the behavior of the subject that uses it. It is being made, transformed, and modified by them. End of the quote. In this way, the notion of codes continuously devouring to one another goes against the idea of essentialist or substantialist identity, and is the people who puts in motion identity. Also, this last quote has similarities with the debate of structure and agency. With these two notions in mind, codephagy and agency, I explore four instances of video games from the Mexican context. The video game released in 2018 Mulaka by the Mexican Studio Lienzo, the Minecraft mode Mexican edition from around 2019. The challenge NESmanía made by Piotr Delgado, the Mexican runner. And finally, the sound art piece 8-Bit Bolero Boom Box from the Mexican sound artist Arcángel Constantini. It is important to remember that Mexico is not a dominant culture in video game developing. According to Penix Tatsen and Antonio Corona, Mexico and Latin America is a region that, while not being part of the centers of productions for video games, such as Japan, the United States, and Europe, is a region in which consumption has had a constant and rapid growing, being close to the levels of consumption of those dominant regions. This aspect has the consequence that what is played here are mainly video games produced in other countries, and the representations portrayed in such products are directed primarily to those dominant regions. The following cases exemplifies different ways in which we can see how the codes coming from those dominant cultures interact with the local ones and how are devoured to one another. Mulaka was released in 2018 by the Mexican Studio Lienzo. The original idea came from a conversation between Edgar Serrano and Adolfo Rico, developers and founders of the studio. Imagining how would it be like to make a Zelda-like game, but telling a story coming from indigenous people, in particular the raramuri, also known as tarahumaras, which are located in the northern region of Mexico, mainly in Chihuahua. The development team from Lienzo and the anthropologists that help them are urban people that are translating those raramuri codes into the codes of video game industry. Codes like a third-person perspective, exploration, and combat. A Zelda-like game. The visual designer stated that there are no representations of the myths, so they had to create them by taking inspiration from the abstract patterns used for their clothes. For the gameplay perspective, an example are the myths of the three souls of the Sukurame, a mythical being in raramuri culture, are used as lives in the game. Here, the dominant cultural codes are the conventions of the industry in terms of music, graphics, and gameplay. The developers are the ones rebuilding the video game industry codes with the remains of the raramuri codes. Here, they are in a position of power in relation to the raramuri, but at the same time, they are moving within the constraints of the industry. There are many Mexican theme modes for Minecraft. For the purposes of this presentation, I will take in particular the Mexican edition because it is one of the most known Mexican theme modes for the game. What we can see in this mode are textures and images that come from everyday life in Mexico. Street advertisements, religious images, and popular music icons. One interesting example is the covering of the sun with the image of Luis Miguel, a pop singer nicknamed as El Sol de México, the Sun of Mexico. But it is made from a Mexico City perspective, including images from politicians from this region, like Claudia Sheinbaum, governor of Mexico City, and changing the textures of the cards to the colors and logo of the metro subway in Mexico City. In this case, it is the Minecraft digital code, which is devouring the codes of Mexican everyday life. The digital codes are the dominating ones because the modders are not modifying the internal rules of the game, and the gameplay stays the same. Instead, the images and music are changed, but not entirely. In the case of the NESmanía challenge by Piotr Delgado, known as the Mexican Runner, we can see different forms of agency in playing, such as counterplay or emergent play. But that by itself cannot be considered as codephagy. However, here I want to draw attention not to what happens inside the game, but to what happens when video game playing happens. The challenge name, Piotr explains, takes inspiration from the TV show NintendoMania, which was a TV show from the 90s in Mexico that showed tricks, walkthroughs, and news of Nintendo games. The challenge began in 2014 and ended on 2017, and consisted in beating all 714 games officially licensed by Nintendo for the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES. In this case, the digital code of the games is untouched, but for the streaming sessions of playing the games, Piotr displayed some elements that in appearance were just conventions of Twitch, but by rebuilding them in his stream, he actively made a pragmatic difference. The dominant codes I recognize are the use of the English language as predominant language used in the context of video game streaming, the games themselves, and Mexican stereotypes. We can observe that the Mexican runner does not fight them back and accepts them, but with a parody twist. For example, speaking with a noticeable accent, of course this could be considered as a consequence of his usage of the language. But on the other hand, if we take into account his contact swearing in Spanish, which turned to become a meme in his community, this aspect comically defies in an unthreatening way the English language convention. Another important element of this rebuilding of codes is that for a big number of games he displayed a parody version of the cover image of the games. Here we can see that some of the elements of these parodies were not recognized by everyone because of their localized character. In this case, the title Galaga is replaced by the name of his city of origin, Jalapa. The attitude of echar relajo, or making fun of, Itala Schmelz identified it as a Baroque ethos, a notion also by Bolívar Echeverría, in which the values of modernity are played or act as in a theater play, and reproduced, but without really believing in them. In the same vein, his use of Mexican stereotypes beyond what we could consider them problematic follows the Baroque ethos, by employing them in humorous ways, challenge his problematic aspects. Quoting Schmelz, it is a picture of ourselves that reveals our inferiority feelings in the face of the technological superiority of our North neighbors, the US. At the same time, it generates a mocking rejection to their civilizing impositions. End of the quote. 8-Bit Bolero Boom Box by Arcángel Constantini. Playing with the word bolero, Arcángel Constantini arranges 8 boleros from the Golden Age with an 8-bit timbre. This type of sound is one of the most easily recognizable elements as part of video game culture, and puts them inside a bolero box functioning as a speaker. A bolero is also a type of informal job in Mexico, most practiced by men, in which the bolero cleans and shines shoes. Boleros normally use a small box where they store the tools and equipment for the job, which is used as a footstool for their customers. Constantini's musical box is shaped after these small bolero boxes. By the box losing its original function of a work tool and the music arranged and heard in the context of sound exposition, the codes of Golden Age bolero songs and the bolero box are devoured by the dominant codes of 8-bit music and sound art. But, inserting the aspects of bolero songs and the bolero box taken from everyday life in the Mexican context into these dominant codes of 8-bit music and sound art, Constantini reveals those dominant codes by transforming them from the inside. However, it is worth noting that 8-bit music is not considered as a high art. So, in this case, this video game code is also being eaten by the sound art, a more serious code. With these 4 cases of study, I tried to show how the notions of agency and codephagy can be useful to describe and understand different aspects of video games produced, modified, played, and appropriated in the Mexican context. We can understand codephagy as agency because both terms point out to practices in which there are relations of power, and in the case of codephagy in the Latin American urban context. I want to finish by noting that both notions are useful to observe these practices without dividing the continuum of culture and video games with our theoretical terms. Retaking the discussions of cultural identity, these 4 cases of study also show different forms within the Mexican urban context of identity being made, transformed, and modified. Thank you very much.